Welcome to the Saco Museum. I'm going to show you around an exhibit that is just getting ready to close called I, My Needle, Ply with Skill, Maine Schoolgirl Needlework of the Federal Era. This is a collection of samplers that were largely stitched in Maine by Maine girls starting in the late 18th century and working all the way up to about 1846 for the most recent one. So we're going to begin right here in our display cases in the hallway with a couple of band samplers that are the type of sampler that were worked by girls at the very beginning of the sampler making era. And we know that samplers were made in England and then in America starting at least in the mid 1500s, but these two samplers probably date from the middle of the 18th century. We also have in here a piece of needlepoint or stump work that was worked by a sister of a young man that was in the Boston Tea Party event. These were two young girls from Thomaston, Maine, and they worked a very typical piece of needlework, probably around the 1750s. And like many Maine girls, they were taught in Boston because there were no real female academies in Maine at that time. And their piece fits into a group of needlework that are often referred to as the fishing lady pictures, although their work doesn't have a fishing lady in it. It does have many of the other components that are typical of fishing lady pictures, such as the fleeing stag there and the spotted dogs that are chasing it. And a lot of the fishing lady pictures have the fellow in the red coat on the horse there. We also have a piece of needlework that was worked by Sally Fairfield, who was a daughter of a very famous Saco minister, John Fairfield, and we know that she was instructed in Boston. We are unsure of her school, although I suspect it may have been the Academy of Eleanor Druitt. And if you look at her needlework here, it has the same stag and leaping dogs. And again, these are a common element of needlework from that era. They don't always reflect the teaching of the same woman. But Sally never got around to finishing her sampler. It does fit into a group of at least 4 or 5 other very, very similar works. So we know that at least one teacher was teaching the same project over and over again, like many teachers did. They seemed to come up with a design plan and they went with it. In this showcase, we have a couple of interesting things. Well, they're all interesting. We have a small sampler that was worked by Eunice Cutts, who is a daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Cutts, whose very large portraits done by John Brewster Jr. we have in the front gallery of the museum. And she probably worked that sampler in Saco before she ever was sent to Boston for education, because she was only 9 when she did it, and that would have been very young to be sent to one of these boarding schools. Next to it is a much grander piece that was worked by her sister, Elizabeth Cutts. Elizabeth was at the school of Eleanor Druitt in Boston, and she wrote home to her father to ask him which of 2 possible layouts for the Cutts coat of arms she should use, as the man with the book with the pictures of these had shown her 2, and she wasn't sure which one was the right one for her Cutts family. Whatever the case, somehow or another, the man gave her the wrong pattern to do, and instead of working a Cutts family coat of arms, she worked one for an entirely different family, and no doubt it was hung on the Cutts wall for many years in place of pride, but it wasn't theirs. After the beginning of the 19th century, right at the very beginning of the 19th century, very substantial and popular female academies began to emerge in the cultural center of Maine of the time, and still, Portland. The first large group that I was able to identify all feature a queen stitch border. They often have 2 paired monuments at the bottom. The girl's name is very boldly spelled out. It always says AET and the girl's age, and it typically names the precise date when she finished her sampler. And we know that Deborah Gordon finished this sampler in 1804 in the dead of winter, and I know of at least 2 others in this group that were finished within 2 weeks of that. So these girls no doubt sat in the cold winter light next to some window trying to see well enough to stitch these very minute queen stitches, which are quite challenging to do. Deborah Gordon finished her sampler. She was 18 at the time, which was quite old to have been instructed, and within a couple of years of that, she had married a young man from Gorham. She moved to Gorham. Within 9 months, she had died. Within a year, her husband was also dead. A lot of the family that she married into died of consumption or tuberculosis, which was a very common disease among young adults at that time and was just practically uniformly lethal. And his family is said to have died of that, and perhaps she did as well. one of the interesting things about Deborah Gordon's sampler is another side story that it tells us. Deborah's brother was Nathaniel Gordon, and Nathaniel's son, also named Nathaniel Gordon, turns out to have been the only slave trader ever executed for that in America. Slave trading had been declared piracy in 1820, but it was largely ignored by anyone who was had the ability to enforce this, and although slaves weren't actively being brought into the United States, the slave traders continued the triangle trade, bringing the slaves into Cuba instead. And Nathaniel was caught just off the coast of Africa. He was brought to New York City. He was kind of released on his own recognizance for about a year. And then with the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln felt like an example had to be made of somebody who was engaged in the slave trade, since young men were going off and dying, to stop this whole thing. And he decided to make an example of Nathaniel Gordon, and Nathaniel Gordon was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. He thought his sentence would be commuted. Everyone said it would be because nobody else was being sentenced for this crime. It was not commuted, and he was executed. But his first and second mates, who were also arrested, were basically slapped on the wrist and released right after his execution. And although other slave captains had been caught, he was the only one who was ever really prosecuted for the crime. As you can see, this is a large group of samplers. I found at least a dozen in this group that I think can be attributed to the same teacher. The samplers span the years 1804 to 1820 of the ones I found. And given those dates, I think the only possible teacher that could have taught this school would have been Rachel Hall Neal, who was a young woman. She had grown up Quaker. She gave birth to twins in 1796, and 6 weeks later her husband died, and she was forced to find a way to support herself, and she opened a female academy that she ran at least until the early 1820s, and by that time one of those twins, Rachel Neal, was all grown up, and she helped her mother, and the school then ran until probably into the 1830s sometime. It's quite possible that this group came from some other academy, but of the ones we know of right now, that's the only one that spans the necessary years to account for the work. Another academy that we're aware of is that of Sally Perry. Sally Perry opened her school in 1805, as far as we know, and it closed in 1807. And the reason it closed in 1807 is that Sally got married. And we have a very unusual sampler here that was actually stitched by Mary Lewis, who was a student of Sally's, and she has wrought by Mary Lewis in the school of and for Sally Perry. And then, most unusually, because these genealogical Portland samplers always feature the genealogy of the sampler maker, Mary Lewis not only dedicated this to Sally Perry, but she put Sally Perry's background on it. The only thing was, because it wasn't her family, she made a teeny tiny mistake, and she has the wrong birth date, I think, for Sally, because if she has the right birth date, Sally started her school when she was 16, and that seems very unlikely to me. I think she was actually more like 26, and then this, instead of being, it says 1789 is her birthday, I think she was born in 1779. This group, I found 4 samplers in the group. They all feature the village across the bottom, this sort of leafy sprig with the bow on it, the girl's name spelled out, but you can see the border, which is also queen stitch, is rather different from the one from Rachel Hall Neal's school. But there are so many similarities between the various Portland samplers, and it's really because it was a fairly small town. There were styles that probably became popular. Parents may have enrolled their daughter in one school instead of another, and said, I really like the samplers they're making over at Rachel Neal's school. Can you teach my daughter a sampler kind of like that? So I think there was a lot of sort of somewhere between cross-pollination and stealing between the various teachers and their design elements. This one, worked by Deborah Phillips, is one of probably a pair. We know there is a book called American Samplers that was published in 1921 by members of the Colonial Dames of America, where they went out and attempted to find all of the American samplers that they could at that time and document them. And Deborah's sister's sampler, Harriet's, is recorded in the book. and describes it as having a rose border and saying genealogy, but it says that Deborah's has a scene across the bottom, which is kind of interesting. Whatever school, and we don't know what school this was worked in, that Deborah did her sampler, perhaps the teachers, no doubt she and her sister probably attended the same school. That was usually the way. And the teacher probably had more than one design that you could work, and they did different ones. And Matilda Greeley's sampler, we only know of her teacher, Elizabeth Hussey. It's named on this sampler. This is the only sampler I know of that we can attribute to Elizabeth Hussey's school, and it's also the only one I've seen that's just like this. So there may be more Elizabeth Hussey samplers out there. We just aren't seeing them. And finally on this wall we have one that was worked in the school of Mary Ray. Mary Ray was, her father died when she was very, very young. She was in Windham, Maine. She probably opened a female academy in Windham and ran it for a number of years, but then her younger brother, Caleb Ray, became a doctor, moved to Portland in 1822, and when he moved here and opened up a medical practice, she moved here with him and opened up a female academy. She was probably an experienced teacher at that point because she was already 35 years old. She has left a large body of work that she was the teacher on, and this one worked by a daughter of the Carruthers family, and we can't be sure exactly which, we believe this was worked by Janet Carruthers. She has left us a large body of work, and like many from Mary Ray's school, part of the scene is painted and part of the scene is embroidered. And this one, instead of being worked on linen like most samplers, is worked on silk. Silk is a lot less durable than linen, and you can see that there are cracks and losses in the fabric here. But because it's in this frame, it's kind of being held stable. You can see that it has certain design elements in common with the one that we just showed you. Mary Ray's later works typically include very, very recognizable buildings that she no doubt drew in, and then the girl may have sort of painted the highlights and did the stitchery. This one, not so much so. It seems like more of a fantasy scene, but it features these very long satin stitches that are quite unusual on Portland samplers. This sampler that's in the display case here was worked by Nancy Cushing in 1818 and is one of 4 that we have located that were worked in 1817 or 1818 that are identical. And the best of these is the one worked by Sophia Dyer that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. They all feature genealogy, the date, stars on the corners, a very attractive border, the girl's name spelled out in a wreath at the top, and then this funny L-shaped scene at the bottom. And it's kind of interesting because they all have a little house like this, and that second-story window is always stitched in white, like it's shining out a light. I do not know why they only date from basically about a year and a half, whether this was a school that was only briefly in operation, or possibly it is because we aren't finding the works, or the third possibility is that the teacher did this style for a while and then just changed to something else. But they are so attractive. There are other Portland samplers that have the girl's name worked in a wreath at the top, and we are not sure at this time if all of these wreath enclosing the girl's name samplers are related, or if, again, it was just something that one teacher did and another teacher liked and took the idea. So it's something to sort of watch for, and it would be very nice to try to figure out who this teacher is. This sampler by Flavilla Ann Barker tells an interesting story. Flavilla's sister's sampler, Mary Jane Barker's, appeared in American Samplers, that book I mentioned from 1921, and it was described there, and the descendant that gave the information said that Mary Jane went to Mrs. Neal's school in Portland, and that she went there hand in hand with her neighbor Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Well, it turns out that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow never attended Mrs. Neal's school. We have pretty good information because he was famous about what Henry Wadsworth Longfellow did, and he went to the school of Abigail Fellows, who was a widow. Her husband had died. He was probably engaged in the slave trade since he died in Cuba. He died around 1805, and then she opened up a female academy in Portland that she operated for many years. Mary Jane's sampler's location was unknown, but I was able to track it down where it had sold at auction on the West Coast in the year 2000, and they very kindly sent me a photograph of it. And they didn't, I didn't know where it was, so I didn't think I would have it for the exhibit. But then I found out that the Androscoggin Historical Society had Mary Jane's twins sampler, and it turns out that not only were the girls twins, but their samplers were twins as well. So I believe that this sampler was worked in the school of Abigail Fellows, not Mrs. Neal, even though one or the other, who knows. This one by Sara and Bonny says on the back in a very old note that was written by the daughter that it was worked in Miss Hall's infant school. And the date of this sampler is around 1832. And it's possible that this was worked in a millinery shop that was run by Abba Hall and Harriet Purinton. And not too long after this sampler was worked, one of the ladies got married, the millinery shop closed, and so it probably accounts for this being a very small group of samplers. This other sampler in the display case was worked by a member of the Knight family. There are a number of samplers in this group, and several of the characteristics that that link these samplers together are that the girls generally don't put their own names on them as far as saying who finished the sampler. They're always genealogical. They often say progeny. And all of them in the group have these cute little inked-in cherubs at the bottom and these weeping willows at the bottom, which are a symbol of death, commonly used symbol of death in that period. The cherubs are believed to have been sort of a calling card, kind of a signature element put in by the artist that designed these, and we believe that that was Martha Mayo, one of the 6 daughters of Martha Merchant Mayo, whose husband, Simeon Mayo, had moved the family to Portland around 1800. By 1810, he was no longer living with his wife and daughters because he had become so severely alcoholic that he was unable to support them. So Martha Merchant Mayo kind of had to find a way to support herself and her daughters, and she opened a female academy. We know that the academy was in operation from about 1818 on because of a little bit of advertising, but it's quite likely that the school had opened before that. Most of these academies we can only identify because they advertised, because they appeared on city directories, because they are rarely named on the samplers. And sometimes we can hazard a guess because we see a woman as a head of a household on a census at that time, and she has a lot of people in her household. The census did not name women until 1840, so it's very hard to track down that women are here and they're in business. And often the women, even though they were running these academies, they might have been living in a male-dominated household, and their names would just completely elude us. So there's a lot of guesswork involved. The women who ran these academies were so entrepreneurial and so much stepping out of the mold of their time with what they were doing. I mean, women were not expected to support themselves. If their husbands died, they should go home and live with their parents again. And for women that wasn't a possibility for one reason or another, this was one of the few ways that they could really, be successful. So the School of Miss Mayo here, we have kind of a mismatch here. This one also was worked in her academy. This is a silk embroidery on silk, and really, although this one is a little bit damaged, it represents sort of a crowning achievement for this student. It would have been expensive for the parents they would have to bought all the materials for the girl to make this. The instruction period was fairly lengthy. This was a very complicated piece of stitchery because it was hard to stitch on silk. It's likely that the teacher did all the designing, and then the girl may have done the painting, or it may have been professionally painted. We know that there certainly were times when professional artists did the painting on these, and we also know that there was a Portland artist that advertised that he would paint for ladies' needlework right at this time. So the possibility exists that all of this was professionally painted, but we also know that of the Mayo daughters, only Martha, the supposed artist, married, and she married in 1826, and after 1826, no more of these ones with the cherubs have come to light, and the work that seems to emerge from that school is no longer so artfully done, so I think they lost their artist and they just kind of carried on. These last two of the Portland group of samplers are interesting for a couple of different reasons. Both of them are morning samplers. We think of this as a very grim sort of piece for someone to create and hang on their wall. That wasn't so at that time. It was perfectly, death surrounded people. You know, when you died, you were laid out in your parlor. Most of these girls lost siblings, they lost parents, they were sort of surrounded by death in a way that we no longer are. And after the death of George Washington, the country was sort of plunged into this fervor for mourning. And these pieces really sort of fit into that whole paradigm. So we have the work of Charity Noyes Merrill that was probably made around 1810 in Portland. I do not know what teacher is responsible for this lovely piece of needlework, but although it's kind of hard to see, all on this monument, this sort of gray shading is actually done with tiny little black stitches that just are so complex and interesting. And then finally, the work of Sarah Jane Moore, which is nice just because it is just, I mean, besides lovely, it's not faded at all. I think it's about as bright as the day she worked it. This one was worked in the school of Mary Ray. It features a lot of real buildings. So we have on it Portland Head Light and also the Portland Observatory. We know of 3 schools in Portland at this time that were designing these morning embroideries, and all 3 of them included these big flowers in the foreground that are so typical of Portland work and just don't appear anywhere else. So if you find a silk embroidery and it has these big flowers and a monument, it's almost certainly from Portland. Yay! Of the 3 academies, Mary Ray did the best big roses, though. Hers are so naturalistic. So now we're going to leave the Portland samplers and look at the creativity that was occurring outside of Portland at the same time. Just about the same time that there was a lot of creativity in Portland, there were also female academies springing up all over Maine. Many people could not afford to send their daughters to the Portland schools. They couldn't afford to have their daughters board in an academy, and most of the academies that were outside of Portland were not boarding schools. Most of them were day schools, and often they were much smaller. We know that the Portland academies could have had upwards of 40 students at a time. These other academies that were out on the countryside often had probably just 2 or 3 students at a time. So we have arranged the samplers in this exhibit beginning in York and sort of working our way north, and what we are doing with that arrangement is asking you to look for features that unite these samplers, common features that might imply that the same teacher was designing them. And really, a lot of sampler research at this time has to do with finding those schools, because up until recently, the thought had always been that these girls stitched these samplers at their mother's knees, sitting by the fireside in the evening, and we now know that most samplers were actually school projects. The very basic marking samplers with just alphabets and numbers might have been the product of a district school, where all the little girls and sometimes the little boys did a little bit of stitchery. These more complicated pieces were worked in the rural female academies. This is the work of Lucy Hale Lambert, which is interesting not because of Lucy, but because of Lucy's daughter, who it turns out was the fiancée of John Wilkes Booth at the time that he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He was secretly engaged to her, and on the night that he assassinated Lincoln, he had dinner with her, Lucy, and her mother, Lucy. And then about 8 o'clock at night, he pulled out his pocket watch, glanced at it, and said, "Oh, I've got to go, I've got plans." And he recited a line from Hamlet that really had to do with forgiving him for any sins that he may commit. And off he went. When he was shot in Virginia about 2.5 weeks later, they happened to look in his wallet, which was known as his pocketbook at that time. They looked in his pocketbook, and her picture was in there. Unfortunately, hers was not the only picture in his wallet. He actually had the pictures of several young actresses in there as well. Maybe they were just friends. So Lucy's father got her out of America lickety-split because he didn't want her to be wrapped up in the enormous scandal that was about to engulf her. And he took her off to Spain, where he had just become ambassador, and somehow she escaped the scandal. This one, worked by Narcisa Lyman, shows several of the features of southern Maine, coastal New Hampshire, northern Massachusetts. It is worked on a combination of linen and wool, known as linsey woolsey, and that usually results in this very dark background, black to dark green. It has a heart's feature. It has a trefoil border here. All of these things are very, very common. Narcisa was an orphan when she made her sampler, and she stitched this verse about the orphan. She finished her sampler on November 8th, 1827, and just 3 weeks later, her brother died. He was her only surviving relative, and she had fortunately left room, and she was able to add his name. These two samplers, worked by Mary Elizabeth Wentworth and Mary Augusta Shapley, were both worked in the same female academy, that of Betsy Hill, which was in the Eliot area. Eliot's a fairly small town. Both of them have this interesting round tree with these either round leaves or fruit, don't know which. They have baskets with stems, with birds sitting on the baskets. And Mary Augusta Shapley's also has an urn with some sort of little scarves hanging off of it that also link to another sampler that was worked by a third girl that isn't in the exhibit, but that one actually names the teacher. And these are also common, and we also know that there was one more that was the twin of Mary Augusta Shapley's. It's nice to see how they all relate to each other, however. Sally Wentworth stitched this lovely morning sampler. She stitched it dedicated to a little sister that she had never known, was born and died before she was born, and then to her brother that she might have remembered. She said somewhere on there, "So fades the lovely blooming flower," and poor Sally, when she finished her sampler, she came home and she died too. So there was one more blooming flower. These two samplers both emerged from Wells. One of the ways, as I mentioned, that we can find these female academies is to look for newspaper advertising. Wells was not served by a newspaper at this time, so we don't have any access to newspaper advertising. We have looked in the Kennebunk newspapers right next to Wells, and we haven't been able to find any advertising even there for Wells academies, but these two have enough similarities that they were almost certainly made in the same academy. Abigail Bragdon, after making her sampler, moved down to York, where she eventually married and had a family. Hannah Hill stitched a genealogical sampler with her name and that of her 5 siblings, I believe, and then she died. She was the only one of the siblings to die, though all the rest of them lived to be quite old. There was a fairly substantial group of Kennebunk samplers. This one, worked by Harriet Stephens, memorializes the event when General Lafayette returned as a rather older man and toured America for more than a year. It was kind of like his grand return. And she has General Lafayette passed through Kennebunk, and she put the K up there on top. And hers is nice because it also relates to one stitched by Susan Lord. They have many elements in common, and they were probably both stitched in the school of Sara and Anne Grant. And we know again of that school because of the advertising. Lucy Jenkins's sampler was worked in Wells and is just interesting. It's a, kind of faded and everything, but I mentioned earlier about the genealogical information that is contained on these samplers and really adds to their appeal and kind of makes them collectible by more than one group of people. She notes that her father, Alexander Jenkins, died September 28, 1779. My father's lost at sea, she says. Her mother went on to remarry, which was a good thing because she had quite a few children and she really needed somebody to help her out, I suppose. This group of samplers is all connected to the same Saco woman. This is a marking sampler that Sara Moody probably worked as a very young woman. But then she went on to open an academy. She worked this genealogical sampler as a 26-year-old, which seems very, very old to be working that kind of thing, and tells us one of two things. One is possibly that some adult ladies continue to work samplers. We haven't got a lot of evidence of this. I suspect the actual reason for it is that she made it as an example for her students, because we know she opened an academy just at that time, and we have 2 works that were completed by her students that very much resemble her sampler. This one was worked by Elizabeth Kendrick, and then we have another one that was worked by Martha Waterhouse, who was a fairly recent arrival in Saco. She had come from the Stroudwater area of Portland, which is a place that name is pretty much associated with. We know that most samplers were brought back and presented to the proud parents as evidence of their daughter's accomplishment and the care that they had taken in raising and educating her, and they were often displayed on the parents' walls so that if potential suitors came in, they could see what a marriageable young woman this was. Later, when the parents had passed away or were downsizing or whatever, often the girls ended up with their own samplers if they were still alive, to want them. And at that point, it wasn't always a source of pride for the girl that it had been when she was very young. When she was very young, she was proud to put in her birth date and show how young, how accomplished she was at such a young age. But when she hit 30 or 40 or 50, she wasn't so sure she wanted her age on her sampler anymore. And Betsy, like a lot of women, picked out the date when she was born. It was okay to put that she was born on June 8th, but she didn't want to say that she was born in the previous century. She was actually born in 1799, so when she picked out the 99, she didn't do herself any favors. She should have picked out the whole century. This is a group of work, these three, all by the same young woman. This is a marking sampler done by Anne Matilda Nye, probably in Saco, and then she went on to do 2 silk embroideries. And if you think back to the silk embroideries that I showed you earlier from Portland, these were made at almost exactly the same time. They are framed in every bit as attractive a way. These are the original frames in Eglamise mats. However, the design element just is lacking in these rural samplers. It just doesn't begin to come up to the gorgeous landscapes that were being stitched in Portland. And it just goes to show, I think, that the very, very most talented teachers were teaching in an urban area, and these teachers that had maybe fewer design skills ended up teaching the smaller schools and couldn't possibly command the large classes and big bucks, not really, that the teachers in the urban areas had. Anne Matilda stitched these in honor of her grandparents, Thomas and Elizabeth Cutts. She put their initials on the 2 urns, and these are beautifully stitched, but they are not beautifully designed. They're still, nonetheless, terrifically appealing, I think. And we do have one more silk embroidery here that we think has come from Saco and is just as charming as can be, but is not beautifully drawn. The little sheep kind of falling down the hill here, and she has these oversized arms, and her face isn't too swift either. This one, worked by Eliza Eldon, Eliza Eldon grew up and died very young in Buxton, Maine, which is quite close to Saco. Eliza Eldon appears on a list of students for the biggest of the Portland academies, the school of the Mrs. Martin. The Mrs. Martins ran a school from 1803 until about 1832, and very close to when they closed their school, because they came into an inheritance, they published a list of 582 girls that had attended there, and they gave us enough information about the girls that we can often pin them down common names to particular girls. What has been less easy to pin down is a body of work for the school. We know that there were a certain number of silk embroideries that emerged from there that almost always depict a scene called the Lily and the Rose. I have not been able to find a cohesive group of samplers. I have probably 5 samplers in this exhibit from girls whose names appear on the Mrs. Martin's list, and every one of the samplers is entirely different from the others, and I think they were worked away from the school, perhaps before the girls attended there. I think it was such a sophisticated school that they didn't make samplers there. This sampler here was worked by Mary Hawkes. It was worked in Windham. Windham is the town that Mary Ray came from that I mentioned earlier, who opened a Portland Academy in about 1822 when her brother moved there. As I said, she was about 35 when she moved to Portland. I suspect that she was already an experienced teacher. I think she probably taught in her hometown. We have every evidence that she lived in her hometown up until when she moved to Portland. And this sampler with its queen stitch rose border, presuming that it's designed by Mary Ray, shows that she's aware of what's happening in Portland at this point. This sampler was made in about 1811, and she's incorporating some Portland elements. It's much simpler than the Portland samplers, but it shows more design flair than, say, the ones that are being designed in Saco at about that point. And then this group of 2, and there is one more that I discovered, all 3 of the girls who worked these lived in the West Gorham, sort of Limerick area. I don't know whether these 3 samplers are very attractive. They're very elaborate. They don't look like rural work to me. I suspect they may have been made in Portland, but because the girls, none of them came from, fabulously wealthy means, it's hard for me to imagine their parents having the money to send them to the Portland boarding school. So I wonder if these actually represent the work of an academy. Around the time that these samplers, which spanned just about 10 years, were made, the Gorham Academy opened, and it represented part of a new movement in education in Maine. Up until that time, public school had pretty much ended with the 8th grade with the district schools, but late in the 1700s, like late 1790s, and then especially between 1800 and 1810, a number of towns in Maine began to open their own sort of high school type academies. Gorham Academy, Thornton Academy, Freiburg Academy, Bridgeton Academy, all of these, and some of them hired female teachers and no doubt taught the female arts, and others, like Thornton Academy, only hired male teachers, and although they educated females, they did not teach them this now going out of style form of education. They strictly concentrated on the academics. So this is a sampler that was worked by Narcisa Stone. Narcisa Stone is another one of the girls that appears on the list of students of the Mrs. Martin's Academy in Portland. As you can see, this sampler is entirely different from that Eliza Eldon supposedly stitched, possibly at that academy. What's interesting about Narcisa Stone's sampler is that it has many design elements that very closely relate to samplers stitched right around 1800, which would have been about 10 years earlier in Berwick. Including one that was worked by Elizabeth Cutts that you would be able to see in several sampler books because it's changed hands a number of times. These elements include this kinky carnation thing, these satin stitch hills with the spots on them, which might be strawberries, and these very tiered pine trees, and then it has this trefoil thing. And see the trefoil border that I mentioned to you earlier that was on Narcisa Lyman's sampler? What's interesting, however, is that Narcisa Stone stitched this sampler in Brunswick. She almost certainly stitched it under the instruction of Catherine Palmer Putnam, who was the grandmother of the publishing magnate George Palmer Putnam. Catherine opened an academy around 1805 or 6 in Brunswick, actually 1808, sorry, and she operated that school up until 1829 when it caught fire and burned down, and she relocated to New York City. Narcisa Stone was the oldest of several sisters and a brother. All of her siblings died in their late teens, probably of tuberculosis. None of them married. Narcisa raised them all up herself because her parents had died. Of the large family of children, only Narcisa and her brother lived to adulthood, and she never married, never had any children, and her brother only had one child, so the family very nearly died out. All of the samplers were probably stitched in Catherine Palmer Putnam's school. We have another group of samplers over here that are related to each other and came from the town of Bristol, Maine, which is a relatively small town on the coast. It's near Damariscotta, Wiscasset. The first of these was stitched by Sara Hunter. She stitched it in 1791. Although it's terribly faded, it says right here in this place, worked at the school. Oh, let me see, what does it actually say? Taught by Mrs. Brunto. I suspect the N is missing off of Mrs. Brunto's name. I think it was probably Brunton. Brunton is not a common name in New England if you check census records. There is a Mrs. Brunton on the 1830 census in Bristol. She's a 60 to 70-year-old woman who's living with another 60 to 70-year-old woman. It may be that teacher. I'd like to think it's that teacher, because what we have here is a very interesting body of family work. We have Sara Hunter's, and then we have her daughter, Sara Ann Chamberlain's sampler worked at the age of 7, her second sampler worked at the age of 8, and her third sampler worked at about the age of 10. And then we have her next sister's sampler, Nancy Chamberlain's sampler, and this is possibly her first sampler. And then also in a private collection, we have a magnificent work that isn't exhibited here that was worked by Nancy, and that was probably her culminating work. And wouldn't it be nice to think that Mrs. Brunton instructed them all? This is a silk embroidery that was worked by an only child, Mary Guild. She worked it at a school that was run by Rhoda Remington. Rhoda Remington first appears on our radar in about 1803 when she is probably a widow. She has 2 young daughters, and she advertises in Boston papers that she's opened a female academy in Dedham. By about a year later, she's in business in Providence, Rhode Island, and she's providing the primary competition for a very famous teacher, Mary Balch. Rhoda Remington wasn't quite as famous, but she advertised a lot, and her school closed up in about 1808, and many people thought she had just sort of disappeared. married, died, whatever happened to women then. In fact, she had moved to Hollowell, Maine, where she opened up a female academy, and she taught until 1815 when she married a War of 1812 veteran that she probably had met up there. He was from Charlestown, Massachusetts, which was really kind of like her hometown too. And he had been sort of stationed there during the war, so that was probably where she met him. She had her student work a silk embroidery that she had probably drawn called Washington Giving the Laws to America, which she had copied off a print source of the period. And this is extremely elegant, elaborate, and it was being worked at a time that Hollowell was this incredibly rough and ready village that was the home of Martha Ballard, a very famous midwife, whose book, A Midwife's Tale, describes her misadventures as she falls off horses in the middle of rivers and things like that. So we have the really strong contrast between Martha Ballard's very rural life and Rhoda Remington's very, very posh academy. Almost at the same time that Rhoda Remington was closing her school, the Reverend Daniel Kony was opening a school in Augusta, which is right next to Hollowell, and his Kony Female Academy stayed in business pretty much forever because it gradually evolved into the Augusta High School, Kony High School. So it never closed. And all of the work from the Kony Female Academy, which spans a number of years, really reflects the teaching of just one lady who stayed involved with the school for many, many years. And the Kony Female Academy samplers almost always have a rose border that's very attractive, and nearly every single one of them features some kind of little leafy vine that's really a calling card, and they often name the academy as well. And one of these samplers was worked by Martha Ballard, the midwife's granddaughter. I should mention that the Kony Female Academy was probably one of the larger academies in Maine, and although we have found about 5 samplers from that school, I would really expect that there are probably quite a few more out there, and that this is a body of work that people should be sort of looking for and focusing on. We have here 2 samplers that emerged from Norwich Walk right around 1820. They were probably made in the school of Catherine Swan Lyman, who had moved up to Norwich Walk from Northbridge, Massachusetts. She had an uncle in Norwich Walk, and that was probably why she came there. These both have an interesting sort of stepped format on the border that resembles the samplers of Essex County, Massachusetts, and Catherine Swan Lyman's predecessors had in fact come from Essex County, and that may have been the connection and why she brought that style up there to Norwich Walk. Unfortunately, Catherine Swan Lyman, she married a minister, she had a couple of children, she wrote a number of religious tract books during her lifetime, but her life ended in the Augusta Lunatic Asylum, where she was an occupant for many years at the end of her life. Looking in this display case just for a moment, I wanted to mention that samplers were certainly not the only product of these female academies. Many girls were taught plain sewing, and that would have been an initial exercise, and plain sewing really had everything to do with trying to learn how to put garments together, because these women at the beginnings of their sort of adult lives would have been responsible for creating all the clothing that their family wore. There was really nothing available off the rack, as it were. You could either pay to have a dressmaker make your clothing, or you stitched it yourself. So this little miniature shirt, which you can see is tiny, is an example of a plain sewing exercise. This is an example of tambour work, which was a type of decorative embroidery done with a tiny little hook on a net background, and the machine to make that net had been invented in about 1808, so the net suddenly became something that was economically viable and developed a style that had been around, a technique that had been around for quite a while, but all of a sudden it became enormously popular in female academies. This body of work here all emerged from the same small town of Bethel, Maine. Bethel is over near the White Mountains. The work spans, this and other pieces that I have seen, span probably 30 years and share common design elements and probably represent the teaching of just one woman, and perhaps she was running a district school, or perhaps she had a little female academy. It's so hard to know. Again, no advertising, so we don't have too many answers. Catching up. The final work of the main section of this exhibit is the work of Sara Cheney. It was worked in Eastport, Maine. She completed it in 1849. By this time, the female academies were going out of business as their preceptresses reached old age and passed away. Sara Cheney made a sampler that is very, very similar to where we begin in Portland. It features a rose border and the genealogy and the progeny, and whoever designed the sampler was certainly very familiar with the Portland work of the previous generation. But Sara Cheney stitched her sampler on the ground that the now incredibly popular Berlin work was being made on, and like many types of needlework of her lifetime, it was stitched with hers was stitched with a combination of wool and possibly silk, but on this much easier to work background. And it just sort of like a nice ending to where we began in the glory of Portland in the beginning. And the final 3 samplers in the exhibit actually are not main samplers at all. They were stitched in Londonderry, New Hampshire, in a female academy called the Pinkerton Academy that opened in about 1817. And the interesting thing about the Pinkerton Academy is that the first preceptress there, whose name was Mary Knight, just copied almost stitch by stitch the samplers that were being made just a couple of years before in Lynn, Massachusetts. Those featured satin-stitched cornucopia and these little diamond-shaped satin-stitched things, and they had these floral borders, and they had this tiny leafy vine, and they said family register, and it was inside of thing, and the girl's name was often in a heart, and they often had this daisy thing at the top. So Mary Knight had some connection, which I have never been able to sort out yet, to Lynn, Massachusetts. Perhaps she had been instructed there. Sally Cochran's sampler is interesting because it belongs to the Saco Museum, and because of the story that is hidden in her sampler. Sally Cochran wrote, "Each moment has its sickle and cuts down the fairest bloom of sublunary bliss." I can't say that word. Well, Sally Cochran was the fairest bloom that was cut down. She was murdered at the age of about 26. She was the mother of 2 toddlers. She and her husband employed a young man to help out with the farm by the name of Abraham Prescott, and one day Abraham went strawberry picking with Sally and beat her to death with a fence post. He was later executed for his crime. These women at the beginning of their stitching careers really had to be responsible for sewing all of the clothing that their family wore because clothing wasn't readily available in stores yet. As they matured, that situation changed completely, and by the end of many of these women's lives, clothing was fully available in stores, and these women continued to stitch anyway, even though it had dominated their lives, and now they were able to give up the needle. They didn't do that. They used their talent and their creativity to decorate their homes, to create beautiful clothing for their children, objects for themselves, and they surrounded their lives. And I think it's an evidence that all of us have this strain of creativity and this need to let that creativity out. And although they weren't accomplished artists, they still did beautiful work. At the time, there were many patterns available that these women could copy, but the patterns were rudimentary, and they had to be talented seamstresses to create the work even with what they had. I want to thank you for visiting I My Needle Ply with Skill at the Saco Museum. My name is Leslie Rounds. Thank you. Saying this remarkable incident where this young man, while sleepwalking, attacked this family with an axe. So he's reading the record of this trial from Rhode Island that was just, it was like the O.J. Simpson trial at the time. It was the